Stop wasting your time pricing flights and hotels on the same old sites. There is a much better way to buy business travel. The only site you need is Upside.com. I used Upside and it is a complete game changer. I have booked flights and hotels for Washington and New York using it. In less than 5 minutes, they showed me the exact flights I was looking for, plus the big name hotels I might want to stay at. And this is actually what makes it different. Is it bundles the flights and hotels together, and then also it shows you kind of what other flights and hotels you could use to maybe save money that might not be the exact ones you were looking for. That's the service that's like a travel agent that they offer. If you're usually booking your own flights, you have to be the one to kind of guess at what the cheaper options might be. They will show it to you. And you get a gift card to places like Amazon every time you buy a trip. Bundling saves your company a lot of money, and Upside gives you a gift card. Forget about how you used to buy your business trips and try Upside.com. Right now, when you use the promo code FRIENDS, you're guaranteed to get at least a $100 Amazon gift card for your first trip. That's code FRIENDS to get a $100 card free. Upside.com, the better way to buy business travel. Minimum purchase is required. See the site for complete details. Hi, I'm Anna Marie Cox, and welcome to With Friends Like These. And longtime listeners may know that I sometimes describe this show as being about awkward conversations or difficult conversations. And you may also know that I get shit from my Crooked Media cohorts about this. The boys over at PodSave think that is a not great way to advertise the show because people don't want to listen to difficult conversations or awkward conversations, that's very off-putting. So we had a little conference call this week and tossed around some other ways to think about the show, and I actually had kind of a breakthrough, which is I have realized what this show is really about. The conversations part is important, but maybe not the emphasis. The conversations happen because of what the show's larger purpose is, which is, to quote an early guest and friend of the pod, Jeff Chu, this show is about messy coalitions. This show is about the limits of coalitions and about forming them. It is about the limits of relationships and friendships and what they mean and how they can help or hurt the coalitions that we need to have. So, John, Tommy, my news for you, if you are listening, is the show is no longer going to be taglined about awkward or difficult conversations. This is a show that's actually about relationships and coalitions. It's about friends like these. Two very good friends on the show today. In the second segment, I'll be catching up with Jane Coaston, who is my former colleague at MTV, now a writer and journalist in DC. She most recently had a great piece in the New York Times Magazine, which we'll talk about a bit during her segment. And then first segment is with Tom Nichols, who is a professor at the Naval War College and another never Trumper who I want to talk coalitions with. We're going to get some perspective from him on the impact of Charlottesville on foreign policy, but then delve into some of that totally not awkward, but very interesting conversation about what are the limits of a coalition that involves progressives and never Trump folks. A last piece of news for the show is that we're going to start doing a weekly letter from listeners. So if you want to be a part of that, please write the show at withfriendslikePod@gmail.com. You might want to put something in the subject line or obviously in the body of the email that you are okay with your letter being read on the air. But we're going to start doing that. And those letters should be about the kinds of things the show tackles. Again, the limits of relationships and the possibilities of coalitions. With that, we'll get started with the show. I'm speaking with Tom Nichols. He is a professor at the Naval War College and the author of The Death of Expertise. Hi, Tom.
Hi, Anna.
So I wanted to have you on to talk about many things. We are long overdue for a conversation. But one thing I saw you bring up on the Twitter machine that I feel like has been not as discussed as perhaps it should be, because, man, we have a lot to discuss these days when it comes to Trump and Charlottesville and the state of the nation, was the impact that these last few days are going to have on foreign policy and diplomacy.
Yeah. Of course, everything the president says has an impact on foreign policy and diplomacy, because that's the nature of being president. Everybody studies every word that comes out of your mouth.
Right.
But I think that the past few days have a link between what's going to happen at home and what happens abroad. And this is where I should add, by the way, I don't speak for the Navy or the government in any way, or Harvard or anybody else. Okay.
Is that Harvard? You just pulling that out? Like, I don't speak for Harvard either.
No, well, I teach extension. I teach at the Harvard Extension School as well. So I don't represent anybody.
Should we name everyone that you don't speak for?
my cat.
No,
I don't speak for Carla. I don't speak for anybody.
Okay.
So, I think there's an issue of credibility and temperament that foreign leaders are going to look at here, because the problem is that when the president establishes a precedent of saying, here's a very reasonable thing I'm going to say, and then a day later says, remember, when I say stuff like that, I really don't mean any of it. That causes, a credibility issue, not just in American politics, because of course his own staff and other members of Congress, including Republicans, are all reeling from this. But it does raise the question of, well, when the president speaks, does he mean what he says? Can he be triggered? Can he be made to fly into a rage? What are the things that will make him act irrationally? And this is the kind of stuff that foreign intelligence services and foreign analysts look at very closely. And of course, they don't look at any of this in isolation. They're going to look at this in combination with his Twitter feed, which I saw this morning was on, full blast. They're going to combine this with what they're seeing coming out of leaks from the White House. I think yesterday the story on General Kelly had 17 sources. It's gotten to the point now where, just to defend against any criticism of those stories, reporters are getting, a dozen and a half sources at a time. And I think that does have a huge effect on foreign policy. I think presidents, when it comes to foreign policy, there are some very important qualities: a certain amount of stoicism, certain amount of economy of words, the importance of meaning what you say and saying what you mean. And I've been critical, just to be clear, and to give Trump the tiniest of breaks here. I was critical of President Obama. If you're going to talk about red lines, then you have to mean red lines. Mm-hmm. That was a huge failure of the Obama administration. This is that beyond all reason. Now, this is basically saying, look, whenever I'm saying something in a much more reasonable mode, wait 24 or 48 hours, because then what I really think is coming. And that it's a bad strategy for business. It's a bad strategy for politics. It's a terrible strategy for foreign policy. And
just to be clear, we're talking here not even about the content, really. I mean, we're talking here about the form and format and reversals. Because I was, I have some very well-meaning relatives who just want to really, they're trying. They're looking for, ways.
Yeah, but this is going to ruin Christmas.
I know. Oh boy. But one of the arguments that I heard from my incredibly well-meaning but deluded conservative relatives was it shouldn't matter the way that Trump conveys information, right? Because this is let's rewind to just the first reversal, on Monday when he did his teleprompter, I guess Nazis are bad. I hate Nazis, right?
Yeah, it doesn't work that way. And I can understand why people want it to. I mean, the response that I got from conservative colleagues was, you never Trumpers are never happy. He denounced them. And it's like, well, okay. But that's that's like being married to somebody who says, once a week, I'm not sure I love you or I hate you. And then, when you say what, they say, well, I did say I love you when we got married. That there is an earlier statement. Well, that doesn't mean anything. I mean, you can't, when you start walking things back, you can't just start cherry picking which things were most convenient for you to believe. But that is how people have to deal with their trying to make sense of why they support the administration at this point.
But I'm even trying to make sense of kind of the form and format part of this. Like, I do want to dive into what his statements about, Nazis and race and civil unrest mean for foreign policy and foreign relations. But I really am curious, because I know you've studied his Twitter feed and you've written about the ways that foreign powers and specifically foreign intelligence services look at our president and what kinds of information they try to gather. And some of it has to do with content, but a fair amount of it has to do with like the way that things are delivered and even tone, right?
Absolutely.
So it matters that he was like reading from a teleprompter, right? Like they take into consideration the way he talks as much as like the content.
Well, the teleprompter version, absolutely. The teleprompter version was, Americans and I think people overseas could say, okay, this is torture for him.
Mm-hmm.
The body language, it was, I was like physically uncomfortable watching it because it was so, strained and so forth. So if I were in Moscow or Beijing or London or Paris, I'd say, okay, this was written by somebody else. This has to do with American domestic politics. This is completely irrelevant to what's actually going on and to what he thinks.
Mm-hmm.
And that's really a problem, because when you start parsing and splitting apart all of these presidential statements, you don't want an opponent to be able to say, well, I'm going to go to the tweet buffet, or the videotape archive, and I'm going to pick this and this and this, and that's going to be how I'm going to deal with the United States. That's very dangerous. The president's messages have to be consistent, and like I said, I think the lost art of a certain amount of stoicism here is really important.
And let's just stay on form for a little while longer, and the form of Tuesday's press conference, his attitude, his demeanor, how were foreign, powers looking at that?
I personally found it unsettling, and it, makes you wonder how much information can the president take in, and where does he get his information? I mean, it became this kind of strange, the president always reminds me of kind of, your angry grandpa watching TV in the next room while, yelling at the TV while everybody's trying to have dinner. And you say, boy, I wish he wouldn't watch that show, or I wish he wouldn't get his information there. And that the form of that, I think, suggests that he can be easily sidetracked with whatever he saw last. And if I were a foreign power, I would think about that. I mean, I'd think about, where do you put out information? Where do you hope it catches the president's eye? What things does he watch? Because clearly the last thing he saw will come flying out of him in a rage. Mm-hmm. And I think it also says that he's easily provoked. I mean, that really wasn't that adversarial. You and I have been watching presidential press conferences all our lives. That wasn't even close to the most adversarial environment.
No, it wasn't.
He was standing in a building he owns, for one thing, in his hometown. I mean, it's not like the old days of, Sam Donaldson yelling at him under the portico in the White House, yelling at Reagan. This was, not the worst situation he could be in. And again, it tells a foreign opponent how, in a negotiation, how do you make him mad? What does he look like when he's mad? Because that's another important thing. What are the kind of tells? If you think of international relations as like poker, the president puts out a big schematic of all his tells every day.
Yeah. And gosh, was it someone, I can't remember who said something about a president you can bait with a tweet. Isn't someone who was that?
Yeah.
There's some lady I remember, but she had problems with her emails. So I don't take her seriously. I do now want to let's get to the actual, the thing that's the more serious part of this discussion. Well, I guess it's actually both pretty serious parts of it. The form and the content are both important parts of what's happened and what it means for America on the world stage. But the actual content, of course, is of dire importance as well.
Right.
What our allies are seeing and what our enemies are seeing. Can you talk about that?
Well, for one thing, I think, it's a strange position for a conservative like me to be in, because I've spent most of my time saying, listen, I don't really care what the rest of the world thinks of American domestic politics. I'm against the death penalty, but when the European Union says you Americans should be against the death penalty, I say things like, mind your own business. It's okay. Listen, it's okay if I pick on my other, my fellows, but this is not, you go about your business and,
Right.
and keep that to yourself. On the other hand, now we have the problem that the president of the United States has defended Nazis in public. And, there are other countries in the world that are going to look at that a little more closely. I don't know. I'm going to pick one at random. Germany, France.
Yeah.
There are places that still
England,
have pretty strong, living experience with Nazis. But now I don't think that anybody is going to take away from this that the president is a Nazi. And I personally don't believe the president is a Nazi. I think, that's going a little far.
Isn't it sad, by the way? Oh my God. Do you believe what you just said? Like, right. You had to say that. You had to say.
Affirming, I do not believe the president is a Nazi. But I found myself in the same position years ago when my conservative friends would get on me about Obama, who I opposed and wrote about and did not think was a good president. But I always found myself saying, guys, he's not a communist.
Right.
He's not a socialist. But yeah, this is the furthest out I've ever seen anybody, that in common conversation, we sort of stroke our chins and say, well, just for the record, I don't think the president's a Nazi.
Yeah.
But I think that I think it's a signal to a lot of our friends and allies that he is a man right out of kind of 1962. That, you got to, where I grew up in the 60s, Trump doesn't seem that different than the guys who used to hang around my brother's bar by the railroad tracks, having shots and beers and complaining about how, the civil rights movement is a good thing, but those rioters, it's a throwback to an earlier time that we should have been done with 50 years ago. And I think it's this kind of casually prejudiced and bigoted approach that says that this is really a man out of his time. And I think our enemies say here, because of course places like China, Russia, they don't care about American race relations, and that they may see an opportunity to say, hey, that's a great icebreaker. I mean, the next time Putin sees him, that's a great icebreaker. Hey, those minorities, huh? Mm-hmm. I mean, what's up with that? Am I right, Don? Because that they don't have to be concerned about that. So I think there is no world in which this does any good.
Doesn't it also communicate to places that are human rights abusers? I mean, if they didn't already know,
I
this is a president that doesn't give a shit.
Because they know, really bad human rights abusers know that they're in a different league than, casually bigoted old guys from Queens.
Okay.
They know they're playing in the majors, and that that's just that. They know that there are people like that. They know that it's not going to really, alter American policy all that much. Certainly not at the United Nations. But I suppose it gives them a little bit of schadenfreude, and it gives them the propaganda tool. This is probably the more important point. It gives them the propaganda tool to play the whataboutism game. When someone says, you're a human rights abuser, and they can sort of, shrug nonchalantly and say, well, your president speaks well of Nazis.
Of course, Trump himself has played that game, right?
Well, whataboutism is the American national sport now, and it drives me crazy because, of course, I grew up in and started my career during the Cold War, where the Soviet answer to everything was, and you lynch Negroes. Mm-hmm. That was a common Russian expression. We'd say, well, you treat Jews poorly, you're a prison camp of a country, and they'd say, but you lynch Negroes. Well, to have Republicans playing that game against each other, not just against, Democrats or other countries in the world, when Republicans were the Cold Warriors who used to have to take the lynching slam in dealing with Soviets. I mean, I got that one myself in the Soviet Union. You kill Indians, you lynch blacks. Is just, to me, stomach turning that we would even go down this road. But yes, the president played the whataboutism game, and I think he played it very poorly.
But he also did it, though. I was going to say he did it about Putin, and he used Putin's line about the U.S.
Yes, to me, that's the worst one. That, I mean, as nauseating as the Charlottesville event, the comments about that event were, to say that, well, we have killers in this country and we're no better than Russia. That one, and again, I'm not suggesting to anybody that they have to feel about it the way I do, but having spent a good part of my life trying to deal with the Soviet Union and Russia, that one hit home, and I took that one very personally.
So, and I should remind people that happened during the campaign. It was during one of his interviews, I believe, that maybe 60 Minutes. I don't want to get too far out on a limb about it, but
right.
Yeah, he said that we have killers too.
America's not so great.
Yeah, America's not so great.
Sure, Russia's made mistakes, but America's not so wonderful. And I mean, I felt like I watched, 50 years of not just Republican, bipartisan, 50 years of bipartisan American foreign policy just go up in flames for no reason other than that the candidate needed something to say at that moment.
Ring's mission is to make neighborhoods safer. Today, over 1 million people use the amazing Ring video doorbell to help protect their homes. Ring knows home security begins at the front door, but it doesn't end there. So now they're extending that same level of security to the rest of your home with the Ring Floodlight Cam. Just like Ring's amazing doorbell, the Floodlight Cam is a motion-activated camera and a floodlight that connects right to your phone with HD video and two-way audio that lets you know the moment anyone steps onto your property. See and speak to visitors, even set off an alarm right from your phone. With Ring's Floodlight Cam, when things go bump in the night, you'll immediately know what it is. Whether you're home or away, the Ring Floodlight Cam lets you keep an eye on your home from anywhere. Ring Floodlight offers the ultimate in-home security with high visibility floodlights and a powerful HD camera that puts security in your hands. With Ring, you are always home. Save up to $150 on a Ring of Security kit when you go to ring.com/friends. Again, that's ring.com/friends. You are a never Trumper conservative. You've kind of laid out some of your conservative bona fides as we've been chatting. Before we move on to some maybe slightly more challenging conversations, I want to actually maybe have a discussion with you that might get a little uncomfortable, but I'm going to stay on some common ground right now and ask you, so can you give me any intel about what's going on with your fellow Republicans right now? I mean, I'm sort of asking everyone what
we're all fine.
Okay,
we're fine.
Good.
Thank you for asking. Remain calm. All is well.
Okay.
I feel like you'd think that at this point, the Never Trumpers would be saying "I told you so" a little more loudly. They're not. I think we're all patriots, and we're all deeply concerned. I mean, this really isn't the time for playing gotcha. I think for the people, and this is just my personal read, anecdotally, I think for people that went hard in, went all in and hard over for the president beginning last summer and right through November, it feels to me like they're going through the stages of grief. That, they started out with everything is fine. No. It's, they started with denial, right? Of, he's going to pivot. It's all good. And then it was, anger. You people, you just hate him. And then, we got to the bargaining of, well, he did say this one thing. How about if we focus on that instead of, the thing he said the next day? But now it almost feels like things are quieting down. I think the Charlottesville remarks were a turning point where, we really are getting, at least for some of those folks, you're getting closer to acceptance of saying, this is just awful. It's the way it is. Our optimism is gone, but now we have to kind of slog it out for the next, 3 years. And this is, but the kind of grandiose promises and, making everything great again, I don't sense that. I sense a more subdued atmosphere. And again, even among those of us on the other side of that issue within the conservative movement, you're not getting a lot of, I mean, I've done it a couple of times to say, well, because I tend to be a sarcastic, snarky guy to begin with. And I've been saying, well, if only someone could have warned you that this could happen. But even there, it's almost like none of us, there's really no pleasure in it. And I think we're all kind of settling down into the, well, now what sort of mode. And I think that's about the only thing we can do. I think the other thing, at least for folks like me, is that I've been getting mildly irritated with our Democratic friends who keep
Here
saying,
we go. This is actually what I wanted to talk to you about.
This is it, right? This is it. Now we can impeach him. And I can't, I said to somebody the other day, you can't impeach somebody for being annoying or offensive. Mm-hmm. There are other things going on, and this whole talk about the 25th Amendment is just silly. That's not going to happen either. So I think a kind of realism is setting in. My sense of the conservatives is kind of defeated. A kind of defeated miasma of realism is setting in around them. And hopefully that'll settle in among the Democrats as well, who need to let go of these kind of lightning strike theories about what's going to happen next.
Yeah, for what it's worth, I mean, I think he's a moral monster and a terrible president. But I agree that there's no Deus ex Congress, right? I guess it'd be Congress ex machina would be the right phrase here, at least with this Congress and this cabinet.
And this is something people have to remember about all that 25th Amendment talk. You'd have to get 2/3 of Congress.
Yeah.
That's not going to happen.
Yeah. Not with this one. No. I mean, I think that we have a new ball game potentially in 2018. But for now,
if Democrats don't screw it up.
Okay. Here's where we get to where I want to talk to you that we may fight. So I feel bad because I've come to, you're a cat person. You are snarky. You're a never Trump person. You remind me much of probably our mutual friend, Rick Wilson. So I'm just loath to bring this up, but I feel like I need to, because I saw you on Twitter kind of roll your eyes in a metaphorical sense. Perhaps you were doing it in real life as well, at some of the rhetoric being used by progressives around Charlottesville. I think specifically in the ways that they are tying the events of Charlottesville and Trump's rhetoric to the history of the Republican Party, modern Republican Party.
Yes.
Okay. So your take on that seems
Charles Blow in particular, I think was who I was reacting to.
Yes. So tell me what you are thinking there, and then we may have to fight and not be friends, but I'm hoping that we can
Let's start by remembering our common bond of cats.
Yes. Though cats aren't, cats don't give a shit. So,
well, I don't know. I mean, I'm not sure about that, but I think my cat has sort of centrist Republican tendencies, but I respect her privacy.
I think they're anarchists, honestly. But anyway, let's move on.
I think what I took offense to was this notion that what I thought Charles Blow was doing, and maybe for people who didn't see it, he basically said, look, this is just part of the long march of Republican racism that's always been there. It's, kind of woven into America, and particularly into that part of America. So how can anybody be, because people, when people say, well, you can't be surprised that Donald Trump talks this way. I think Blow was basically saying you can't be surprised when anybody talks this way, especially Republicans. And I said, okay, this struck me as a political strategy to say Trump is sinking under the weight of these comments. Let me just see if I can take him like an anvil and tie him to every conservative who ever lived, which I think is deeply unfair. Because that's like me saying, well, because remember the whataboutism game here that the Republicans have tried to play with this. Well, Robert Byrd was in the KKK. The Democrats were the party of the KKK. Look, we're talking about now. And I think this notion of I think this was, to use a word that liberals love to use, this was overreach to say, I have this moment where I can stick Trump on every Republican there ever was, every conservative there ever was, to kind of strike a big sweeping blow for the left here, for liberalism, for the Democratic Party, for whoever he, whatever he thought he was doing. And I thought it was unnecessarily hyperbolic, and I thought it was unfair, because it basically says there have never been any conservatives, any Republicans who've ever been involved in, ever cared about civil rights. Forget about slavery and Lincoln and all that stuff. That nothing happened before 10 years ago. And I found it to be just deeply unfair. I understand, even a president that I admire, like Ronald Reagan. I understand the point of going to Philadelphia, Mississippi. When Reagan did it, there was an outreach to disaffected whites. There was this kind of pandering in the 80s to evangelicals, who had some of whom managed to, the Venn diagram of the overlap there with retrograde attitudes about race. There's no doubt about it.
And the war on drugs is very difficult to forget for a lot of people too. So
well, and as you know, and I've written about this, I think that the current Republican approach, or at least the Trump administration's approach, and candidate Trump's approach during the campaign, was definitively racist. To say, when black people were taking drugs in the 70s, the answer was tough love and jail. And when a bunch of white people in the heartland are taking drugs, well, now it's empathy and understanding and rehab. And, there was no doubt that we had a racial double standard about the war on drugs, because now people who take drugs are victims when they used to be criminals. I mean, I've lived long enough to see that happen. With all that said, I thought what Blow did was incendiary and unfair. And it did make me roll my eyes and say, this is, as conservatives often say, this is how you got Trump, because you tarred an entire class of people as saying everybody who's to the right of me is a racist. And you say that enough times, people shrug and say, okay, I give up. And I think on this, the name I'll bring into it, the person I think has a great answer to this, who is not a conservative, is Mark Alilla, who's who I've been reading, and who just did an interview with Rod Dreher. And Lilla, I think, has made a great point that Democrats have to stop, then liberals, if they want to start recapturing that kind of mass of the average American person, they have to stop doing this kind of ugly, divisive stuff in response to ugly, divisive stuff. That's what set me off the other day.
I can hear it. I want to really zero in on a word you used a lot when you were talking there, which is unfair, which is really striking to me, because that's a really personalized term, I think. I hear it in your voice and your reaction to that, like that felt unfair to you. Like you felt like you were personally indicted by him because you are a conservative, you admire other conservatives, and you felt that in his statements,
and I'm a middle-aged white male.
And you're a middle-aged white male, and that felt unfair. And I guess what I want to do is challenge you a little bit in thinking that unfair is a not helpful way to as a metric in talking about politics.
Yeah, I can agree with that. I mean, I think, an educated, middle-aged, white academic saying, "Oh, that felt unfair." The sympathy level anybody should have for that is roughly zero.
Right.
And I think you captured my reaction better when you said you could hear me rolling my eyes. Exasperated was actually a word, was the feeling I had right at the moment, more than unfair.
If I can put you on the couch just a little bit, it feels like there's two tracks of your reaction here. I think part of it is exasperated, and you're kind of wearing your pundit hat and saying, like, this is not a useful way to talk about politics right now, right?
Right.
And I kind of want to get off of like talking about Charles Blow in particular, but talking about what I've heard from a lot of like Black political commentators. I think he was using a framing that a lot of people, including myself, actually, not just Black political commentators, but I'm using some of the same framing that he is, but particularly Black people on television right now have been pointing out the continuity line between a lot of GOP policies and what's happened in Charlottesville and what happened with Trump's words. And so I hear you sort of saying on one hand, with a pundit sort of cap on, I don't know what those look like. They're probably ugly.
It's a beanie.
very nerdy hats, maybe a deer stalker. This is not a helpful way to frame things if you want white people to listen to you. And then I also hear you kind of embodying the white person who's kind of not, who's so put off by these statements that you can't hear him. Because I think that because I agree with you that on some level to try to say, you know, to draw that through line between past GOP policies and Trump and Charlottesville is something that's going to be off-putting to people who might be potential allies who are conservative or Republicans.
Right.
And so I think we on the left should have some thoughtfulness about the way that we talk about this stuff. And the best term I've heard recently is that we need to remember to maintain a permission structure for our allies. We need to remember to maintain some kind of path for people to say, I agree with you and I want to be on your side. Right.
Right.
On these particular issues. But I also think that while I think there is a through line here, you know, like not that every Republican ever has been racist or that every Republican or conservative policy is racist, but that we can't, when we're talking about the racism that Trump represents, it does come from somewhere. And there's a reason why he's in the Republican Party and not the Democratic Party. There's a reason why he ran on that side. If he had tried that same rhetoric as a Democrat, it wouldn't have worked.
Well, hang on, because I'm going to throw one penalty flag about this and remind you that back in the day, Donald Trump was a Democrat.
Right. But he didn't win. He didn't win the nomination of the Democratic Party.
Fair enough. Although I still think that the disaffected working class whites who went for him were going to go for him no matter. They don't care about party labels.
Sure.
I mean, I think that his margin of victory was provided by people who, who would have gone either way. But I grant you, in today's Democratic Party, it would have been tougher. But that's why I said, to me, Donald Trump were the kind of guys that I grew up around in 1968, who were all Democrats, who were all blue collar guys, who were all banging shots and beers and saying, that Martin Luther King is a great guy. Sure, I can accept that. And then they would drop an N-bomb right after it.
Right. But they're not Democrats anymore.
Okay. They're not Democrats anymore. But this notion that somehow Trump is the avatar of the modern Republican Party.
Well, he is literally the avatar of the modern Republican Party.
He is my president. He's the president, our president of the United States. But as a party figure, I still think of Trump as a recent arrival who kind of, jumped on the bus and said, you can't drop below 50 miles an hour because we've got to just keep driving. But
he did win the nomination, and congressmen have elected officials are supporting him because they feel that he, up until this point, they felt like he's the best chance to enact certain policies. And I know that you're a sort of criminal justice reform minded guy. So I don't feel like I'm going to get pushback from you on this. And I also know that Democrats have supported terrible criminal justice policies. But it is the Republican Party.
I was just going to say, don't make me remind you of, who led the charge on that one.
I'm not going to, but who's maintaining it? Right.
I agree. Right? I mean, this is and some of this is actually a regional problem, because maybe part of the reason I bristle is that while I'm a conservative, I'm a New England conservative. I'm part of a, breed that's been hunted to extinction, from the old New England Republican Party that doesn't much exist anymore. I mean, the past, people like me, the future is, I guess, guys like Corey Lewandowski, because that might be what he grew up an hour away from me. Now on the other hand, Charlie Baker of Massachusetts is the most popular governor, a Republican, who came out and he pretty forcefully condemned the president's remarks. I think what I object to is this notion that that political movements are irredeemable because of the worst example in any of them. And conservatives play this game as well.
Right. I agree.
That when you they say to you, well, so, Anna, you're basically no different than Al Sharpton.
Mm-hmm.
And it's like, oh, come on, are we having a real conversation, or are we going to play that game?
Well, but I want to point out is that I don't want to pin you when we want to move the conversation from Trump to the modern Republican Party, I don't want to so much. I want us to be able to both agree. Okay, Trump is terrible. Racism and Nazis are bad. But I also hope that I can get some of my friends on the other side of the aisle to look at things like voter ID laws, to look at things like criminal justice, to look at things like redistricting issues, and notice, or at least have their minds open to the ways that those policies have enabled the Republican Party to become a place where you can have a Jeff Sessions and a Trump, and the people who claim to follow them, people like David Duke, be home in the Republican Party.
And I think, the better approach here, and, maybe I keep defaulting to that issue of strategery, is I think that African Americans looking at the composition of the administration could say, look, you need to show, conservatives who are concerned about this, have some empathy. Imagine how this looks and feels, to people of color.
Yeah.
But to say, you guys are bad. You've always been bad. None of you are good. The whole thing is poisoned. I felt aside from being kind of nettled by it, I felt it made me, those kinds of comments make me feel hopeless to say, you know what, we can't have this conversation. I get it. There's nowhere to go, and it almost makes me sort of say, well, we're at the end of the road. We're at the end of the conversation.
Yes, Tom, imagine being part of a group that's judged for what other people do, and had sweeping generalizations made about you.
Of course.
And being told that you can't amount to anything because of an identity that you have. Imagine.
And having a president who is on record, and having a president of the United States, I'll just pile on here, is on record saying, I don't want black guys counting my money.
Right.
I get that. But I think the answer to that is not to turn to every conservative and say, you're just like him.
And I would say that I think what's really interesting here is that what I think is really interesting here, and again, I want to be friends, but I want to point out to you, I think you're taking what people are saying and interpreting it incredibly personally and directly, which is understandable. But I think the critique,
I have to take people on their words.
Right.
I mean, it's.
But I think the critique here is actually of policy.
Right.
And it's not of you personally. It's of, look at these structural things that the Republican Party has done to support a structure that enables.
Well, now wait. At the risk of not being friends, I think the comments that spurred my comments, you're retconning them a little bit and cleaning them up and turning them into a much more reasonable critique than the one that was actually made. Because I think that what you're saying is a much more reasonable platform for discussion than the kind of sweeping condemnation that I was reacting to.
But of course, I am not a black man who just watched white supremacists march without hoods in a southern city in 2017. Right. So I'm a little probably less triggered, as they say.
Well, and it may be an argument for not having instantaneous live punditry 24/7. But I wasn't. To just back up from this a little bit, I didn't stand up and say, I'm personally offended at these remarks. It was almost existential, where I just kind of threw up my hands and said, okay, and in an earlier time when I was a younger man, I withdrew from a lot of those conversations by basically saying, I give up. Because we didn't have a president who was kind of, pushing the envelope of these issues. And I said, well, nothing's really that bad. And I'm tired of these conversations, and I'm tired of them, being laid at my feet. Because the other thing, if you want to do the psychoanalysis, is you have to remember as well, my personal background is kind of the poorer edge of the working class.
Right.
So, everybody, there are all kinds of tough stories, and sometimes this notion that, well, you as a group are no different than, a billionaire saying racist things. Leave aside the unfairness, because we're both grown-ups and we both deal with politics, and I always try to operate on the Michael Corleone rule that it's just business, it's not personal. But it induces this kind of hopelessness that says we are never going to bridge that gap if this is the only way we can talk to each other. And part of the reason you and I are having this conversation is because I haven't given up hope. But in an earlier time, definitely, I just threw up my hands and said, I'm going to go deal with foreign policy and nuclear weapons and the Soviet Union because I don't want to have any of these discussions about.
You found foreign policy and nuclear weapons a more hopeful area of work than
in
domestic
some ways,
relations.
I actually thought that dealing with averting global Holocaust was a little easier than trying to unscrew domestic problems at home. Yeah.
Well, let's leave on the hopeful note. We did manage. I think we're still pals.
Of course,
new friends. We both still have cats. And I find your cat very, very beautiful cat. What, Carla? Is her name?
Carla.
Yes.
Yes.
So people
Carla
should
Tortelli Nichols.
People should check out your Twitter feed, which is
Radio Free Tom,
and also your book,
The Death of Expertise, just came out last spring from Oxford, and it's about why people don't listen to facts. Why don't people listen to experts? Why do people read fake news and believe in crazy conspiracy theories?
And we'll have to talk about that specifically more sometime. But I really appreciate you coming on, and we will chat again. Thank you so much.
Thanks a lot.
So I think you guys know how much I love Blue Apron. It unironically and quite literally saved my marriage. I'm so excited to have them as a sponsor on the show because I had Blue Apron for dinner last night. And I had Blue Apron for dinner last night because my husband agreed to make dinner because we always still have this little bit of a complex like calculus about whose turn it is. He was really tired the other night and I said I would make dinner. But the thing is, it's not a big deal anymore when we trade off these dinner nights because we know that we're both going to be getting about the same amount of work no matter what the recipe is because we're using Blue Apron. And Blue Apron recipes, some of them are, slightly more difficult or technical than the others, but you're max going to be spending about 30 or 40 minutes in the kitchen and you have the ingredients on hand. So like when we trade one night for another, there's like no real drama involved. It is the #1 fresh ingredient recipe delivery service in the country. Probably not everyone loves it the way I do, but it is the #1 delivery service in the country. Its mission is to make incredible home cooking accessible to everyone. You can choose from a variety of recipes each week or let Blue Apron's culinary team surprise you. They are not repeated within a year, so you will never get bored. You can customize your recipes each week based on your preferences. John and I don't eat a lot of red meat, so we get mainly fish and pork and vegetarian dishes. And Blue Apron has several delivery options, so you can choose what best fits your needs. And there is no weekly commitment. You only get deliveries when you want them. Each meal comes with a step-by-step, easy-to-follow recipe card and pre-proportioned ingredients that can be prepared in 40 minutes or less. Just slight sort of, pro tip. Sometimes you have to preheat the oven. I think they do not count that in the 40 minutes because it definitely kind of ups the time. But it is 40 minutes or less for the actual prep of ingredients. I used to kind of think that it was a little bit longer than that, but I've gotten better at chopping and whatnot. So really, it's 40 minutes or less. This week's feature meals include basil pesto chicken with summer vegetable panzanilla. Actually, I think we had that. The panzanilla is the bread salad. It's delicious. Check out this week's menu and get your first 3 meals for free with free shipping by going to blueapron.com/friendslike. Not just friends, but friends like. You will love how good it feels and tastes to create incredible home-cooked meals with Blue Apron, so don't wait. That's blueapron.com/friendslike. Blue Apron. Unironically, a better way to cook. Hello, Jane Coaston.
Hello.
Hi, how are you?
I'm good. How are you?
Okay, no, really. How are you?
I'm okay. I'm largely okay.
All right. In Trump adjusted terms, you're doing all right.
Yes.
Okay.
Yes.
Because I've been thinking about you. I was wondering.
I'm okay.
We've been, you and I, deprived of our main writing platform a couple months ago. So I don't have such a, finger on how you're thinking about things all the time. So the reason I wanted to talk to you is I am curious. What did you make? of the past 5 days?
It's not great, Anna. It's not great.
Your professional opinion, not great. That would be
yeah. That's not great. I think the thing is that like it's been interesting to me that I think that we can all. This is just one area that I've been thinking about a lot. Is it's very interesting to see Trump pivot towards not just his base, but his Twitter base. Not his like, I voted for him and I live in Milwaukee and, I don't get online much, but he seemed, I don't like that Hillary Clinton and he seemed like he might know how to bring back jobs. No. That's not who he's pivoting to. He's pivoting to like angry Twitter.
Pepe.
And I'm like, the vast majority of Americans are not on Twitter. The vast majority of Americans who are on Twitter don't post very often. And the vast majority of the Americans who post a lot on Twitter are not angry politics posters. And yet he's like, that's the base I'm going for. There is a solid Twitter follow. I believe the username is something like Kilgore Trout or something like that. And he was noting that like by really sticking to the statue issue, especially after Saturday, like, do you really think that tax reform is going to happen in September? Do you really think that conversations about like bringing up healthcare again are going to happen? Like when he just decided that like, I'm going to fight Jeff Flake and Mitch McConnell, which I was like, you do you, dude, if that's what you want to get into, whatever. But it's just interesting to see pivoting towards a base that is like not that big, like most people aren't this, like most people are not having these angry, virulent conversations on the internet about heritage, not hate. And yet he's like, no, that's who I want to talk to. That's my base. And it's interesting because there was a National Review post recently that was basically like, if he weren't president, he'd just be shit posting in the comments of Breitbart.com.
Okay, but he won the presidency by being the Breitbart shit poster, by actually having a Breitbart shit poster as his, de facto campaign manager. And I will point out, this is an important, I love your take. And I think that in some ways you're right. Like he is pivoting to the Pepes, but last poll I saw this morning, 67% of Republicans agree with the way he's handling Charlottesville. That's not the Pepes. That is,
it's interesting. So one of our former colleagues, RIP.
We have so many former colleagues.
I know. Ezekiel brought up that the question being asked was not, should we put these statues in a museum or should we put these statues away because they're, the statues of fucking traitors? It was like, should we get rid of the statues because people are offended?
Right.
And so I think that through line within that particular polling question was very much like made to make some people be like, well, I don't want people to just throw them into the moon or something because some people are snowflakes. I don't think I feel like that particular polling line is not that effective. But also the fact that like, I think that, of course, Republicans might support him in the polling question, but also the fact that like, has anything happened? Like, how's that wall going?
Going?
How's the wall?
Oh,
how's
I was like, how about wall go? I was like, is that like Waldo's brother? Like,
no. Remember that whole thing?
No,
it's
wall.
Interesting because
the wall, right? That.
Yeah, remember that?
Yeah,
that thing.
That Mexico's going to pay for it.
50 feet, billion feet tall. It's interesting because I think that, you are right that he ran as a shit poster, but he also ran as a shit poster who was also running for 6th grade class president and was going to give us all pizza and cupcakes.
Right.
And none of that has happened. It's interesting because I really feel like after the healthcare, whatever that was, went down because of John McCain, it's like he just gave up on like policy stuff that was like hard.
Oh, I mean, he's never done a hard thing in his life. A human being only has so much, battery to them, right? They only can do so much. So
it's true. That's why exercise is bad.
Exercise is bad, and so is working hard on anything. You should only do what is easy. So he's going to shitpost. But I actually want to, so that 67% of Republicans who approve of the way he's handling Charlottesville, that was not in response to a question about the statues. That 67% was actually a response to the question, do you approve of how the president's response to Charlottesville? So,
see, that also lends itself to how much did you know about what happened in Charlottesville? Noah Rothman, who writes for Commentary, brought up that...
friend of the pod, actually.
Yes. Brought up that, if you saw that press conference and you didn't know that, there was a rally on Friday in which neo-Nazis were chanting, Jews will not replace us. And then Trump is saying that, I'm sure that there were very nice people on both sides. That might sound true. I think that it goes to a sense of, once again, as we saw in 2015 and 2016, there are a lot of people who, for a completely understandable reasons, on a Friday night are not going to be following Twitter coverage of a neo-Nazi rally in Charlottesville, Virginia. And so when it's brought up, when it sounds like, oh, there were bad, good people on both sides and violence is bad, like that sounds enough like something that seems buyable if you're not following it closely.
I'm going to be real honest, Jane. I did not expect to be in the position of me arguing to you that this is bad and Trump is I'm saying that Trump looks like he's going to be fine, and you're saying you think that actually he's making a mistake in the way he's positioning himself.
I think he's making a mistake in positioning himself, especially by the fact that,
yours is a more optimistic take. This is where I'm finding some cognitive dissonance, because you, my friend Jane, are not someone I associate with, butterflies and sunshine and glass half full. But you're the one who's saying here.
No, I'm mildly optimistic is too optimistic a term. I'm trying to find out, if there's
the glass
level
has water in it.
The glass definitely has water in it.
Okay,
because I think that the issue at hand is that by continuing to discuss this particular issue and just go on and on and on about it, it really is indicative, already, on so many different issues. For instance, Trump will pay out the September Obamacare payments.
Mm-hmm.
He threatened he wouldn't, but he definitely will.
Yeah.
Healthcare reform, and I put reform in quotes because it's
ACA repeal.
Yes, exactly. That's kind of dead.
Oh yeah.
It's dead. And then there's this whole idea of we're going to pivot.
They're going to put up a
tax
statue
reform.
to it. That's how dead it is. That's how bad they lost. They're going to put up statues.
Exactly. Then 50 years, we're going to argue about that too. And then, this whole idea that we're going to talk about tax reform. Do you really when Paul Ryan comes out for an interview in which he's supposed to be talking about his brand new tax plan, do you think anyone's going to ask him about it? No. No one wants to talk about tax reform. Everyone wants to talk about how these people are friends with fucking Nazis.
Mm-hmm.
That's, and especially because now Trump has effectively tied himself to the Tiki Torch awful Nazis. And, if you're trying to pivot from that, especially when now it's, when Republicans are criticized. I'm really looking forward to when Trump just goes all out against Ted Cruz, who he does, who he's already accused his father of killing JFK. So where else do we have left to go? This
Zodiac killer. Trump gets all of his news from the internet. He is going to accuse Ted Cruz of being Zodiac killer. That is the next logical step.
Oh, it decidedly is. And all of this is going to happen at a time where, it's interesting because someone has brought up that if the economy were not doing so well, and it's still Obama's economy largely, this would be more of this would be even more of a problem than it is currently. But just the fact that this is what we're talking about and not pivoting to tax reform, already there are a bunch of people saying that if August is bad for Trump, September is going to be way worse.
Okay.
Because none of that's going to happen. And so it's interesting to, someone, I can't remember who it was, but someone was talking about they'd never seen a lame duck president in his first year in office.
Yeah. Yeah. I think so. Let's just disentangle a couple things here, which is I feel like you're doing a pretty straight political calculus analysis, which is that, Trump has made a tactical error in doing this because he just in the strict terms of his own party's goals, he is becoming less able to obtain them, right? Like you're right. I mean, someone said he has 0 friends in the Senate right now, which is kind of another amazing statement to make, right? The last person who had 0 friends in the Senate was Ted Cruz. So he and
Ted Cruz is a weirdo,
right,
who collects soup cans,
right, and the bones of small children. But
exactly, and I think that goes to another point that at this point, you know, Republicans don't want to audibly stand up for him unless you're someone like, you know, Governor Paul LePage and are insane.
Mm-hmm.
Like the idea that you're getting to a point at which I can't remember. I think it may have been Rich Lowry writing for Politico. You're getting to a point at which, like, if Republican senators are asked to come to the White House, they might say no because it looks bad.
Yeah.
And, like, it's just interesting to see this level of just, you know, you even have, like, the governor of Texas, who is not a terrific human being, being like, oh, no, neo-Nazis are where I draw the line, which I was like, see, that was easy. For normal people, neo-Nazis are kind of like, well, you know, it's the Indiana Jones rule. You just draw that line and then punch them in the face.
Right. So this is the strict political calculus part of it, right? He has made a tactical error in doing this because he's going to have a harder time fulfilling his legislative and other political goals. Okay.
Right.
Is it worth talking about kind of the larger, more existential problems we're facing because of this? The other thing I'd point out is that Jeff Sessions has made no such errors, and he's the one who I feel like is really running the Trump political operation in the sense of his actual policy goals. And nothing is going to get in the way of Jeff Sessions doing what he's doing, which is some of the most evil shit
right,
that Trump is responsible for, right? Like, people are going to be deported, ICE raids are going to continue, ramping up the war on drugs, all of that stuff. Like, it's not like Trump has made such an egregious error that liberals should be celebrating, right? I mean, no. And
at a base level, it's not good when your president seems to believe that there are good Klan members. You know, we've had that before. Oh, yeah. You know, I believe, you know, a former president of Princeton University and also a giant racist.
I don't remember. Somebody. God, some person. Would somebody. That's him.
Yes. Yeah. And it's also, on a side note, it's funny because when people discuss like, oh, you know, well, if we're going to change the names of something, you should change the names of all the, you know, all of the buildings that are named for that president. And I'm like, done. Let's do it. Let's get it. Get that. You know, this is the same guy who was like, oh, Birth of a Nation. It's all so terribly, terribly true. No, you're an asshole. Go away.
The name we're dancing around, everybody, is Woodrow Wilson. So, and yeah, sure. Let's get rid of that name. I'm good with that too. I think we can judge each historical character by their own merits. That's my position.
Right.
If you took up arms against the U.S., I think that you should probably not have a statue. That's kind of general rule.
Right. And I think that the point that I've been raising, because people, you know, including Trump, have been like, well, what about George Washington and Thomas Jefferson? I'm like, what is the number one thing you think about when you think about either George Washington or Thomas Jefferson? It's probably not took up arms against their own country in defense of slavery.
Right.
Like Robert E. Lee, that's what he did. I'm sure he had delightful dinner parties and was very polite to ladies and, you know.
I think he had pets, you know.
I'm sure he did. I'm sure he had, you know, he was kind to all and except for slaves.
He shared some really funny memes, I think, among his troops. So, yeah, no, I agree with you on that. So, but let's get back to, why it's still not good. If Trump made a tactical error in doing this, why should we still be worried? Okay, baseline, not good when the Trump empowers the Klan. Maybe that's all we need to say.
I think that at a baseline, it's almost too difficult to comprehend it, you know?
Right.
Like, I think the why I go immediately into a political calculus is that at a certain point, I'm just like, I am not prepared to put myself through contemplating the fact that I live about like half a mile away from someone who thinks that the people who wish I didn't exist / were murdered are probably also fine, polite people. Like that's, and it's interesting because, you know, so many people, like, it's such a low bar. Like, it's the lowest of low bars. The easiest thing in the world to do is to condemn neo-Nazis. Like, they don't have super PACs. Like, they're not, like, no, you condemn neo-Nazis and the Klan and white nationalists. That's just what you do. It's easy to do. But at a base level, it's interesting because people, you know, I've long argued that residential segregation is perhaps the biggest unspoken issue facing this country. And I think that you really see that from the fact, you know, it's been interesting. I'm from Cincinnati, Ohio. And so the terrorist murderer guy in Charlottesville is from Northern Kentucky, Southern Ohio. And it's interesting because all of his high school friends are like, yeah, he seemed to talk a lot about Nazis. Yeah, he seemed kind of like a racist Nazi. And I'm like, oh, maybe you should have brought that up to somebody, but, you know, whatever. But it's interesting because you see like that with
these people, why won't they tell on their own kind? Jane, I don't know. Like, I don't know. It's like, where was he radicalized, and how come when he was radicalized, his, you know, his colleagues didn't turn him in? That's
exactly.
Better stop those guys at the border.
Those questions.
That's my question. That's my idea. Stop those guys.
Yeah. But with Charlottesville, like, you had people flying in from like Washington State and all these other places, and it's been interesting because someone, you know, a lot of these people are coming from places with Black populations of like 1% to 2%. You know, if you're flying in from like Boise, Idaho, or the outskirts of Boise, or you're flying in from Montana, or you're flying in from even in the suburbs of Cincinnati, like the outskirts suburbs, you're getting into places where there are, like, you know, it's about 90% white, 7% Asian, and 3% Black. And yet you're still like, Black people are definitely trying to genocide us. Like, it's indicative of a country in which it's so large and diverse in such a way, but that diversity for so many people is invisible. Like, many people live in places where everyone around them looks kind of like them, and then they assume that places where people don't look like them must be bad and scary.
Yes, hellholes, I believe Trump once called them.
Yes, exactly. Yeah. And so the idea that all of these people felt emboldened enough to show up to something, it's interesting because people tried to make it about statues. But if you've seen any of the other Unite the Right posters, one of them featured someone like hitting a Star of David with a bat. Like, this wasn't about the statues. Like, the statue was really kind of irrelevant. Like, it's not like Richard Spencer has some like fawning reverence for Robert E. Lee. Like, Richard Spencer has a fawning reverence for himself and food, probably, but not for Robert E. Lee. And the idea that these people just felt so emboldened to show up. And then my favorite thing, though, is that they were super surprised that people got their pictures and were like, but, you know, I'm not that guy. I'm like, yes, you are. You're the guy who flew from like Portland, Oregon to Charlottesville, Virginia to go participate in the fucking Tiki Torch parade. Yeah, you are that guy. That is you. That's what you did. You know, like I said about like, you know, what's the first thing you think of when you think about these people? Oh, he flew 3,000 miles to go to a Tiki Torch neo-Nazi parade. That's your resume. That's who you are now. That's what you did.
Yeah, and there are going to be consequences. I mean, I think that's actually the thing that's so galling and kind of hilarious, is that they think there should be no consequences for their actions, which is something. Apparently they get mad with other, you know, that's one of their calls to action, is there should be consequences. But for them themselves, no consequences. Right. But that's it. That's what white privilege means. To be able, that is the definition of white privilege, to be able to go to a white supremacy rally and keep your job.
Right.
Right. It doesn't get more white privilege than that, really. That about sums it up.
Basically. And just like, I don't know. It's just this idea that this is something that is just even remotely tolerable. And just like the whataboutism on the right, where it's just like, well, there were other violent people. And I'm like, well, there were also Nazis. And I feel it's interesting that, like, well, they were just, they had a permit. And I'm like, one, so did the counter demonstrators. Two, if you're a Nazi and you have a permit, you're a Nazi with a permit. That's not something I need to be like, oh, well, if you've got a permit, that's okay. And it's interesting because, I don't like to say things in the realm of like, I was an African American. But, just watching this as someone who is, who actually is an African American and also has spent a great deal of time studying both Nazism, the OG Nazis, the ones we beat and killed in like 1945.
We punched a bunch of them.
There was a lot of that going around. Yep. But then also neo-Nazism in the 60s and 70s and 80s. And I'm like, I've read the Turner Diaries and things like that. The book that is, one, very bad, and two, inspired Timothy McVeigh and any number of neo-Nazis and white nationalist radicals. Like, the idea, it's interesting because all these people are like, oh, well, they just want to be left alone. They want this, like, white ethno-state. And I'm like, do you know how they plan to create that? It's with murder and genocide. Like, the end of the Turner Diaries is where every non-white person is murdered in the world. And then the order, in quotes, takes over and rules the world. That's the end of the Turner Diaries. There's also they turn some Asians into zombies. Yes, there's that too. They take over the world and kill everybody. Like, there is no, like, the idea, and it's interesting because no, people do not, if you ever have to do an interview with one of these people, just ask, like, what's the end game? Like, oh, we just want a future for our people, except that future seems to involve killing everybody else. Oh, white genocide. I'm like, what would fix that? Having kids. You're like, childbirth helps, but, you'll note that Richard Spencer is very single. Very single.
Extremely single, as they say.
Because white genocide is basically like, they put a black person in a Spider-Man movie, and that made me sad. Like, these are the weakest, saddest, and yet also most violent and virulent people alive.
You're unique. You don't walk like everyone else, talk like everyone else, or sleep like everyone else. So why is your mattress one size fits all? Because a truly customized mattress will cost you $5,000 to $10,000 until now. Go to helixsleep.com, answer a few simple questions, and they will run a 3D biomechanical model of your body through the proprietary algorithms they developed with the help of the world's leading ergonomic and biomechanical experts. And the result is the most comfortable mattress you have ever slept on. Helix customers report a 30% improvement in overall sleep quality, and for couples, they customize each side of the mattress. Your mattress arrives at your door in about a week, and shipping is completely free. And that is why everyone from GQ to Forbes is talking about Helix Sleep. You have 100 nights to try it out, and if you don't love it, they will pick it up for free and give you a full refund with no questions asked. Go to helix.com/Anna, which is spelled A-N-A, by the way, and get $50 off your first order. That's helixsleep.com/Anna. My name, Anna. helixsleep.com/Anna. I have an idea. We were thinking about doing reader mail in every episode. Would you like to help with some reader mail?
I will.
So this one is about this weekend. Hi, Anna Marie. On Sunday night, my husband was FaceTiming with his parents who live far away. As often happens, they ended up talking about stressful topics on which my husband and I disagree with his parents. It started with healthcare, and his dad repeated a lot of right-wing talking points. Eventually, the conversation moved to racism in Charlottesville. My mother-in-law, whom I love, apologized to my husband for voting for Trump and then said, I don't know. I don't know. I think she meant she didn't know about the neo-Nazis, but I don't understand how she didn't know. For the past 2 days, I've been mulling over her, I don't know. It's mushed up with the chant I heard at most of the Women's March here in Austin, no Trump, no KKK, no fascist USA. How could she not know? Why didn't she believe us? Why did it take the death of a white woman in Virginia for her to finally look at racism in that campaign? She also talked about how she's not a racist, but doesn't seem to think that, as a white woman, the work of rectifying racism is also her work. I don't know if there's a question here, but it's something I'm processing and wanted to share.
Well, thinking about that, I think that also goes to, the reason why people, when they heard, you hear a chant at the Women's March the reason why like that didn't you don't want to think this is you. No one wants to think this is you. It's interesting. People have been pulling some really great. My favorite Twitter historian, Kevin Cruz, has been pulling some great primary documents of people who, during the civil rights marches of the late 1950s and early 1960s, they also condemned extremists on both sides, by which they meant the Klan and the NAACP. And it's interesting because no one wants to think of themselves as being in support of the wrong side. You want to think that, of course I'm correct. Of course I understand what's going on. These people are being crazy. Like, this isn't fascism. That I don't really know that much about fascism, but that's not what this looks like. But I think I think that's why you're starting to get all these now like fringe right-wing figures like Dinesh D'Souza, Rush Limbaugh is not really fringe, which is unfortunate, all being like, this was a false flag, left-wing operation, and it didn't really ever happen because it's too difficult to think that it did. Like, all of this is people who are unable to acknowledge the difficulty and the pain of being responsible for something to which they do not wish to be responsible for. And so I think that, the reason why it took that person's, family member until someone died to see what was going on here is because I think in some ways, that's the thing I think that a lot of people don't understand about, how these, how kind of restrictive governments, or how not exactly fascism, but how kind of a government controlled, like a non-democratic government works, is that for most people, nothing changes. If you talk about people who lived in Argentina under like Pinochet, or under, if you talk to people who lived under Ceausescu, for a lot of people, nothing really changed that much. It wasn't great and it was difficult, but if you put your head down and just stayed quiet, nothing was really that difficult. If you're on the fringes or if you're on the cultural outs, they did. And that even happened in, Nazi Germany up until about like 1941, 1942, in which one of the main focuses of kind of the Nazi propaganda administration was not just creating propaganda to tell people about the war, but also making propaganda to keep people's minds off the war, making musicals like Lucky Kids, making like basically all these versions of American movies, but with Nazi themes and German people. And so you have films about people living in Cuba where everyone speaks German. And so, but this idea that, until you see it for yourself or until it directly affects you, a lot of people won't see it. And that's just how people are.
And I just want to point out that for most people, however tragic you find Heather Heyer's death, however much you are moved by her mother's eulogy, however outraged you are by Trump or by his supporters, your life probably, if you're a white person, white cis person who's relatively, able to get around in the world, your life hasn't changed much, and it still hasn't changed, and it won't change. You have to be the one to change it. Like, you have to be the one to get in the fight. The fight is not going to come to you. Like, if you're someone like me, like a relatively well-off, white, married, cis, straight woman, the fight's not coming to me, Like,
right.
I will be able to get an abortion if I need one. I will be able to get healthcare if I need it. I will be able to get a job probably if I need it, right? I have to make myself a part of the fight if I want to be a part of it. I think people need to recognize that. To put it in terms that I know you will appreciate, I've been thinking a lot about, if you've ever wondered how you would fare in a dystopian young adult novel, like, now is your chance, right? Like, now is your chance to join the good guys. Or you can just be someone who's in the background of those novels, right? You can just be one of the workers. But it's going to have to be an active choice for most privileged people. If you're not, the fight's going to come to you. Like, Jane, you don't have a choice, right?
Right.
Like,
no,
you're in it.
Nope. I'm it. It's funny because like I think a lot of people who follow me on Twitter do not recognize, like, especially because I talk to and write about a lot about conservatives and conservatism because I find it interesting. But a lot of people don't recognize, like, oh, I'm like, if we want to get into like, identity politics, like, I'm a gay Black woman and married. I'm like super married, like very much gay married. Like we did the whole thing. Very married. I'm wearing rings right now. I know you've seen them.
Yep.
And it's interesting because I think in some ways, for me personally, I find it, I worry sometimes that if I brought that up more, people would be like, well, this is, you wouldn't be thinking this way if you were, it's interesting because I think we think of like being a white person, especially a white man, as being like the identity, and then everything else is like, but that you just add that on, like putting cheese on something. But like, no, this is who I am. And obviously this is very difficult for me in that, not just from a political standpoint, but also from a personal standpoint, trying to explain trying to think about, I've had nightmares recently of something happening to my parents. My parents have been married for 38 years this November and are, delightful and exhibit a very hilarious height difference. My mom is like 4'9" and my dad is 6'3". It's very funny to me. It's always funny to me. But I have, nightmares, waking nightmares thinking about something happening to them because someone who was inspired by some of this did, doing something like what happened to like James Byrd Jr. in the late 90s or something that like what happened in Charlottesville, and just thinking, because that's, but that's my family. That's me. And it's, I can't get away from it. I mean, I wouldn't want to get away from it. I'm pretty pumped about who I am as a person in a lot of ways, but I can't get away from it. It is unavoidable. It is unescapable that this is who I am. And this is what has been set against me in many ways. And so I don't really have any choice but to stand up against it,
And the rest of us need to be more like Heather Heyer. She went to the fight.
Right.
And
it was, just thinking about how, I loved listening to her parents talk. I mean, actually I did not love listening to her parents talk about her. They should not have ever had to do that because Heather Heyer should still be around and alive. But them talking about how, even when she was a little kid, she always sought out injustices and wanted to rectify them. And she died doing so. And I think that that's something to think about, that a lot of people who, I wrote a New York Times Magazine piece for this past Sunday on the concept of virtue signaling. And this whole idea of people saying and doing things not because they believe them, but because they want to be seen doing or saying those things. Heather Heyer was not virtue signaling. She was virtuous. And I think that's important to remember.
I think that's a good note to end our conversation on. Thank you so much, Jane. Thank you so much to the person that wrote in to spark that last part of our conversation. I'll say again, we're going to do reader mail every week. So people who want to have their question or issue tackled by the pod and friends of the pod should write with friendslikepod@gmail.com. People who love what Jane has to say should follow her on Twitter at
CJane87. The letter C, Jane, numbers 87.
That's when you were born, isn't it?
It is.
Oh, damn. You are young, and I love you. And I'm really glad we got to talk. My best to your wife.
Thank you.
Keep fighting the good fight. Know that I'm with you, and I'll be with you in whatever way I can be.
Thank you. I appreciate that. It's been good talking to you, Anna. How are you doing?
Given all that has happened, I'm okay. Again, my life is not going to change much unless I make it change. I've chosen to try and make it more difficult. So I hope my life gets more difficult because Trump isn't going to make it more difficult for me. I hope that I hope I do the right things and make it more difficult for myself. That's how I am. That's how I'm doing, which I think is good. So we will chat again. Keep up the good work.
Thank you.
So I have interviewed my dad on this podcast. He's a hero of mine. And this is one of the reasons he's my hero. I had known for years that he had protested in the 60s. I kind of thought that that was maybe just what you did in the 60s. Everyone protested in the 60s, right? And I don't know why it didn't occur to me until just a few years ago to ask him in more detail about it. I asked him when he had protested, and he said 1962, 63, which seemed on the early side, kind of, for history. So I asked him, what kind of protest was it? And he said, every Saturday, some other students and I would go to this organizing center and pick up signs, and then we would go to a whites-only business establishment in Fort Worth, and we would picket. And I asked him, wait, you went to a local organizing committee, the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee? He was like, oh yeah, that I think that was it. And it came together in my head that my dad had protested with SNCC, organization started by the Freedom Riders. And that my dad had protested and held picket signs in front of whites-only establishments at a time in Texas when people were being beaten for doing that. At a time when people were being called extremists for doing that. So, what do you want to tell your children about what you did at this moment in history? Are you afraid of being labeled an extremist? I've said before, this moment is not about revealing who Trump is or who his supporters are. We know who he is. We know who his supporters are. I think this moment in our history is going to reveal who we are, especially us white people, I gotta say. Everyone who's bothered by these events, and just bothered, because if you're a white person, you're just bothered, probably, because it's not an existential threat necessarily. If you're bothered by these events, I think you need to ask yourself what you're going to do about it. What do you want the next generation to remember you for? And I want to humbly suggest that if you are a well-meaning, physically mobile, straight, cis, pretty well-off white person, the absolute lowest bar for you is, are you going to physically add yourself to this movement? Are you going to make a call, knock on a door, go to memorial, hold a sign, hold a vigil? Are you going to honor Heather Heyer by doing what she did? Are you going to march? Are you going to move? Because it is called a movement. And a movement requires overcoming inertia. You can't be part of something if you don't add yourself to it. As I was saying with Jane, this fight is not going to come to you, probably, if you're a relatively privileged person. That is your privilege. The fight isn't coming to you. So what are you going to do? When I think about my father, I know I would still love him and honor him if he hadn't held a sign in front of a Fort Worth movie theater in 1962. But because he did, I do more than just love and honor him. I want to be like him. I don't want the next generation to remember me for changing my avatar on Twitter. I want to be remembered for something that I did in the world. I want to hold a sign. I want to march. And I hope you do too. And that is it for the show. We'll be back next week.